Hey class, welcome to our week 10 discussion. If you haven't already watched Alexa's presentation and video, do that first because it gives a great overview of the concepts that we will be talking about in this example. And also she does a great job just explaining, sort of the core ideas in chapter 11 and 12. So this will help flesh that out in a more tangible sense, but definitely watch her video first. Um, for this one, though, I want to ask the question, what counts as success in social work? What is it how do we define whether or not a program is successful? If it's working, how do we evaluate it? And in that, who gets to decide what that is and how to evaluate that? So I'm going to use an example of some refugee resettlement a little bit later on, but for now, just have that in the back of your mind as we move into the presentation. Well, in chapter 11 of our reading, it starts off talking about how do we measure the success or cost or failure of a social work program or a project or some kind of intentional work, right? You can start with a qualitative data, which has to do with, who has helped, what are their stories, how have things been changed, what has been improved, the human, softer, less tangible side of things is what's qualitatively measured. Well, the counter to that is also quantitative measures, which are things that are tangible and firm and countable, such as financial cost or the number of people helped or the number of visits to that particular program, et cetera, et cetera. So, but between those two, then you have chapter 12, which then goes on to asking, so using those two metrics, how do you decide whether or not programs are actually helping and are worthwhile? What is the best measure for evaluating the success of a program? And spoiler alert, the answer is both. But there's this tension that's set up. And what chapter 12 goes on to say is that the consumer, the person who's affected by that, needs to be part of defining the success, which oftentimes they're not. But the good evaluation uses both quantitative and qualitative data, and then incorporates the people who are most affected, but maybe aren't always part of that initially. So for a case study of this, I'm going to use my practicum placement last year where I was working at a place called Sponsors Organized to Assist Refugees. I was out of Portland, and we worked to resettle refugees into the greater Portland area, more or less. Um, and to give you an idea of the scope of this ministry, is what it was, SOAR resettled in 2024 316 refugees. So that's everything from a baby up to an adult. And now I don't have the budget numbers for 2024, but 2023 is going to be relatively similar. And the audit of their expense showed that it costs about $1.48 million for SOAR to operate and settle those 316 refugees. So, that's a significant chunk of money. It's $1.5 million that was spent on helping a relatively small number of people come from other places around the world and settle in here. There was also a lot of side donations. Somewhere around 81,000 that was counted, but there were also hundreds of people involved in the volunteer aspects of it. And that's actually what I did. I helped recruit volunteers and did training and that kind of work there. But I mean, there were probably at least 150 to 200 volunteers that I had contact with and worked with. And in addition to that, there were churches that were providing temporary housing and, people who were collecting baby clothes and, televisions and cooking supplies, volunteers sorting stuff that was donated, people who were driving people around to appointments and to doctor visits and so on and so forth. It was a huge undertaking. And the hard number would say that it costs about $4,700 per refugee to resettle them. which, depending on how you want to measure that, seems like an awful lot or not much. But that's just the tangible, concrete, quantitative data. So that quantitative data can show us whether with SOAR or with any social work program or something we're evaluating, the scale of it, how big it is, what's the cost, the staffing and resources, how many people are involved, how much is being affected, the level of priority. It can show how important this is, right? If it's 1.5 million to resettle 316 refugees, is it worth 1.5 billion for the same number, right? So it gives a level of priority, and then it also provides accountability to funders. You can say to people who donated to that ministry, this is how many people we affected and this is how many we helped. So the quantitative numbers gives us that hard, tangible information. On the other hand, the qualitative numbers tell us things that, well, are hard to show in numbers, right? They don't, you know, quantitative numbers can't show us things like, do people feel safe, right? Do they have a sense of dignity and new purpose? Was there, huge traumatic events that were happening in their past and they've been rescued for that and now set free? Um, there are whether or not they belong, whether or not the community has accepted them, and conversely whether or not the community has grown because those people are here or the situation has now changed, right? Quantitative measures can't evaluate whether or not the volunteers had become better people and prouder of their community and become more involved because of this opportunity, right? So they can't measure the long-term human potential or even the moral meaning or the understanding. We need the qualitative numbers to do that. Of course, that's not always as simple as one might think. So I want to ask the question, how do we measure that in a qualitative sense? Like, so I took this picture when I was working there, and I picked up this mother who had arrived with her 6 children and one grandchild. They were met by some sort of distant relatives there, along with someone from SOAR at the airport. Sum total of belongings, they had like 3 suitcases, and they had been homeless for and in transition, living in refugee camps for about 2.5 years after some intertribal violence had watched the husband murdered in front of the family. And this family now arrived in Oregon. Um, One of the cool aspects of this story is one of our SOAR workers that met them at the airport had been a refugee themselves for about 10 or 12 years prior to this. Right. So now you have these new people that have been rescued out of a horrible situation, trauma-inducing, major problems, brought here to an entirely different culture and worldview and experience, but they are met by somebody who had actually been a refugee, had well adapted, now worked for the organization and was gainfully employed, paying taxes, and so on and so forth. So you can count the quantitative numbers of that, how many years, how much money is paid, how were things adapted, but you also have the quantitative, like how do you tell this story? How do you measure the worth of that situation? So, and the rub of this is when you go to measure it, different people who are involved are going to measure it differently. If you're one of the funders or the people, building, supporting, in this case, a ministry or a program, you're going to be asking tangible, quantitative questions. How many are served? At what cost? How quickly? What are the measurable outcomes? Give me numbers of the people we've reached, how much it's going to cost us, how well has that turned out, so on and so forth. Very tangible things. And the staff or the people who are serving or working in that group, they're going to be asking different questions. They're going to be asking, were people housed safely? Did we do our jobs well? Do they have access now to schools or healthcare or benefits or volunteers that'll help them learn to ride the bus system? And do they have a house that is comfortable and has the things that they need to fit well and adapt into our society? And the refugees themselves are going to be asking questions about, do we feel safe here? Right? Do we feel like this is home and we can fit in here in some way? Do the people here treat us with dignity? Is this a place we can call our new living arrangement and start our lives over, begin again, and have hope and optimism about the future? And did the services that were provided actually work for us? I mean, these people that are driving us around and doing things, like, is this actually accomplishing what we need? Right? Each one of these different individuals is going to be coming at measuring the success of this from a different perspective and a different way. And what we always need to remember when we're holding these, perspectives in tension is that we are making decisions about priorities and what matters in the way we measure it, right? Metrics aren't neutral. The things that we measure reflect the priorities that we have going into it. If we're measuring one life affected, or measuring 300 lives affected, or we're measuring, the amount of change or the number of services rendered, the things that we are measuring reflect what is most important to us. And oftentimes institutions, they offer a privilege, or they have a tendency to measure cost and, throughput, like what has happened, what is tangible and measurable. um, and sadly, a lot of times the people who are most affected by that service, that program, that ministry, are the ones that have the least say and input, right? We want to be able to say, oh, look how many people we helped and served. But a lot of times we have a hard time saying to the people who were served, how was that experience for you? Was it worthwhile? Was it what you were hoping for? And so, as practitioners in social work, we need to intentionally question that imbalance of power at a macro level. So, getting back to my original point at the beginning of this whole thing, we need to use both quantitative and qualitative means to evaluate whether something mattered. We need to realize that it's not always about zero-based budgets and accomplishing things. Now, you're also social workers, and so I assume there's bigger motives for you. But we also have a responsibility to then remind the powers that be of what those qualitative stories are, and ask the people, who are at the bottom, who are most affected, how is this working for you? Does this actually matter? And sometimes those are really hard questions, because we hear things and we go, oh, that didn't really work like we wanted it to. Um, but we need to make sure that cost is not our final judge on what is of most importance, and that we actually listen to the people and hear the voices of the ones that oftentimes get overlooked. We have to, in using good ethics, consider all the metrics, all the sources, all the buy-in and input, to evaluate whether or not what we're doing is helpful, whether the program is useful, or whether or not it makes a difference. So for your part in this discussion, I'd like you to think about something that you have advocated for, or a way you've served, or a program you've been part of, or something that you've contributed to, and think about how that was measured. Um, Reflect on that situation. Now, for me, obviously, I'm using refugees because I've done this work and I've taken these photos and I know these people, and all of that. But for you, like, what outcomes mattered the most when you were serving, or you were involved, or you were participating, that maybe were the hardest to measure? One of the other questions that I would have you ask is, so in those situations and in the future, as you're moving forward, when funders and clients define success differently, whose definition should carry the most weight? And how do you negotiate that? Right? How would you do that at your practicum? How would you do that in a future service opportunity? And then finally, uh, can a program look expensive on paper and still be deeply successful in the ways that matter most? And I think we would say yes from a lot of situations. But I also do want to kind of throw that the other way and ask, but how do we decide when that service, that program isn't successful enough? When is it worth shutting down and saying, yeah, we might have helped one person, but it cost $1.5 billion to do that. And so we're not going to do that again, or whatever. So thinking about stuff that you've done before, love to hear how your responses to these questions. And thanks for listening to this presentation. Have a great day.